Okay, now let's talk about the lynx and the snowshoe hare up in Canada. And so this is a famous example of two interacting populations whose population size go up and down and up and down. And so the Canada lynx is the predator here, and the hare is the prey, and the hare is the lynx's favorite food. And so when we look here, we see that there's sort of the lynx is following the hare. So the hare population generally goes up, and then the lynx population goes up. Not surprising, because there'll be a lot more hares to eat. Then, of course, as the lynx population goes up, there'll be more predation pressure on the hare, and the hare's population comes down. And it just goes through this cycle, which, as you can see, generally the lynx following the peaks of the hare. It's interesting that these data were not collected by ecologists doing studies back then, but they're basically estimates of population size from the pelts that were being brought in by hunters and trappers back then. All right, so now we're going to talk about the human population a bit, and so here we kind of transition a bit into what we might call environmental science when we study the ecology of people, of humans. And as we talked about with exponential and logistic growth, we saw that populations can't just keep growing indefinitely, that there become limiting factors that cause the population to stop growing and sometimes shrink. And so an ecologist would say, well, people really aren't any different in that way. And so our population was relatively small for a long, long time, but then recently has gone through significant exponential growth with a few dips here and there along the way. And excuse me. So I want to show you something. Go to a different page here. And here's a Wikipedia page on population growth, and you can see this is a classic demonstration of exponential growth. It's thought that the human population reached its first billion in 1800, and it took 127 years for the second billion, 33 for the third, 14, and then 13, 12, and 12. And so you can see the time that it takes to add another billion. It has decreased. Now the population growth rate is slowing, such that adding the next, we're now at about a little over 7 billion. And so adding the next one will take 14, 18, and 40, and these are estimates, but you can see the rate slowing down. So that's probably a good thing in terms of the Earth's resources and just not being overrun with people on this planet. So indeed, the growth rate of increase has been decreasing. We're now at about 1.1 as a global average. But there's a lot of disparity there, with some countries actually population size shrinking, like in Japan and some European countries, and Russia, and others in sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, countries like these where they're still growing significantly, India as well. Currently, China is the most populous country, but India is set to surpass China very soon. Okay, so now, ideally, a population will reach sort of just a nice, stable, zero population growth rate and maintain its population size. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can either have high birth rates and high death rates that balance each other out, or low birth rates and low death rates. And we'll see that with humans, it's been demonstrated time and again that in different countries they go through what's called the demographic transition, where they shift from relatively high birth and death rates to lower birth and death rates. And that's shown here in this graph nicely, in that early in a society, in a country, when you have your pre-industrial phase, largely agrarian society, you'll have high birth and death rates. There's high death rates because of relatively primitive medicine and hygiene and sanitation and all that. And so you'll have high birth rates to compensate for that. And also in an agrarian society, you need lots of hands to help on the farm, so you have lots of kids, and you may not have access to birth control, so you have lots of kids. Now, as that country, and again, the population just kind of bounces around a little bit, but then as that country transitions or becomes more modern, access to medicine and healthcare and sanitation improves, and so the death rates come down. But the birth rates tend to stay high because of tradition and the expectation that one will have lots of kids. And so therefore, because of that difference, you have a significant growth in that population. But then as the country transitioned to a much more modern industrial or even post-industrial society, birth rates then begin to come down because now people mostly live in the cities, and you don't really need to have lots of kids working on the farm, and kids actually become an economic liability. They're expensive to educate and all, and so birth rates come down. You have access to birth control, and so then you then have low birth rates and low death rates, and ideally the population again levels off at a higher rate than higher level than what you started. And many countries have gone through this. Age structure, you can also characterize a population by the proportion or the number of individuals in each cohort in what are often known as age structure pyramids. And some countries indeed have a true pyramid shape, like Afghanistan here, where you can see they have, and then down below these are the younger, the kids, and then these are the older folks. And so when you have a pyramid shape like this, that's a population that is growing significantly, has the potential to grow significantly because there's so many kids who have yet to start having kids of their own. Whereas when you look at the United States, it's a more, again, developed, mature country, one that's gone further through the demographic transition, where you're now starting to see a relative leveling off and not really a pyramid shape. And then you have Italy, which is a country that's actually shrinking in size. They have fertility rates that are below replacement level. And so you can see these folks here had fewer kids, so it tapers towards the bottom. A couple other things to notice. You notice in Italy and U.S. there's this bulge. That's what's called the baby boom, and those were the post-World War II folks, and everyone was happy they had lots of kids then after the war. Also notice you tend to see a bias a little bit, particularly in the older ages, between males and females, with generally more females, at least in the developed country, although in Afghanistan it doesn't look that way. It looks like there's actually slightly more males. But you sometimes see that bias. And again, these are useful for predicting growth trends. Infant mortality, life expectancy, more characteristics of a population. So you can look at countries and where you see relatively low infant mortality rates. That's going to be a developed country with a relatively good healthcare system. And high infant mortality rate are ones where there's not a whole lot of healthcare for women, and pregnancy is much, and childbirth are much riskier activities. And vice versa, you see life expectancy being higher in those developed countries and lower in less developed countries, again because of their healthcare situation and sanitation. Carrying capacity of the earth for people, we really don't know. Some would say we have perhaps exceeded it already, and that's largely because of what we call our excuse me, ecological footprint. And that is basically the resources that an individual or a community or a country uses. And so developed countries like the United States and European countries, Japan, have a relatively high ecological footprint because we use a lot of resources. And less developed countries tend to have smaller ecological footprints. And so yes, this is ecological footprint. And so as you go further up towards the upper right here, you're getting a higher ecological footprint. And so you can see countries like India, where most people are relatively poor and don't have a whole lot of stuff. They have a relatively small footprint, but these European and the US countries do. Now, I guess what they're saying here with the blue countries is that these are countries that have a high, relatively high ecological footprint, but they also have a high resource base to support them, or a high ecological capacity. These are countries that don't have a whole lot of people relative to their size of their country. Think of Canada, for example. It's this vast country with relatively few people, so they're in a better position to supply those people with resources, whereas the Netherlands, for example, or Japan are very densely populated countries and their resource base isn't quite enough to support their population sustainably. And so when we talk about this ecological deficit, what we mean is there's a good chunk of the world's population, and this would be over 7 billion now, are living unsustainably. That is, they're using resources at a rate that is faster at which the earth can supply them, if you will. And this is the kind of topic that this is essentially what we spend the whole second semester talking about in my environmental issues classes, how society lives sort of beyond its means, you might say. And we talk about ways in which we can transition to becoming a species that lives more sustainably on this planet. And it's, of course, to be seen as to how quickly we will get there someday, but how quickly we get there and how much damage we do along the way are open questions. Okay, that's it for population ecology. Thanks.